welcome. We're originating from the Maud Olson Library, and today, part two of Almond, we have Steve Almond here at the Maud Olson Library with Jude Almond in attendance. and
There's Jude over there.
Hi.
Hi, Jude.
Steve, we're sort of gushing about Gloucester.
Yeah.
And what brings you here, and tell me your kind of quick take on Gloucester. We can get heavy soon enough. But
Yeah.
let's talk about sweet things first.
Well, I should know about Gloucester. I heard about Gloucester many years ago from a friend named Paul Salopek, who happens to be an amazing Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who's walking around the earth right now, slowly tracing the paths of ancient men. Long before he did that, he would go on fishing boats, and one of the places that he went out from was Gloucester. So I heard this name Gloucester probably 30 years ago when I met Paul in El Paso, Texas, of all places. And maybe 20 years later, I met a fellow named Chris Anderson when I was speaking at the school that he teaches writing at. He's a writer and teacher. And he told me he lived in Gloucester, which kind of rung this ancient bell. I said, Gloucester, that's right, I heard about Gloucester, Fish Town. I've heard about this place. And he then invited me up to visit him. I'd never been to Cape Ann before. I'd certainly heard of the Cape, but not Cape Ann. And was completely smitten immediately. At that time, Chris and Michelle, his wife, had a son who was a couple of months older than my daughter. And so we would just go to the beaches of Gloucester with them. And that's been a relationship now. We've been coming up to Gloucester whenever we can for the last 10 or 12 years, and it's utterly magic. And every time we come, we almost bought a house here, is how addicted we are to the place. It's almost a chemical addiction at this point. Partly because every time we come up, the light is distinct. The ocean in all of its various iterations all over East Gloucester and the whole Cape is nuts. We just discovered, I feel bad for even saying it, but really just in the last year have discovered the pleasures and wonders of Annisquam, which feels like an abomination that I wouldn't have gotten onto that earlier. But if you think about the density of natural beauty and sort of what I would call contemplative space in Gloucester, just sort of per cubit, I don't think there's any place that can touch it. I am not that well traveled, so maybe that's not saying much, but just the feeling of the place, the light in it, the sea, and also the sense of literary tradition and kind of community. There's this thing which everybody here in Gloucester knows called the Gloucester Wave, but to people from outside this habitat, the Gloucester Wave sounds almost like a wonder of the world. The idea that there is a communal attitude in which, rather than maniacally trying to get it through the intersection as quickly as possible and beat the other guy, the sort of zero-sum nightmare that we're living in, sort of in America writ large, the Gloucester Wave is this wave of deference of, okay, well, now it's your turn, I see, go ahead. There aren't a lot of traffic signals here, but the traffic signals kind of live within people and their sense of consideration. So even, and I'm idealizing like a city slicker would, but even the sense of the pace of life and the kind of communal spirit when we come up here feels just wonderful and wondrous. So that's my history with Gloucester. I'm an unabashed fanboy.
I want to pick up on the recognition of a real Gloucester cooperative, collaborative, collective, community-oriented town. And then note something that Henry has pointed out, that there's a monument in town that recognizes the 10,000 men who've been lost at sea from Gloucester.
Right.
There's a harshness to it. There's a mix of groups of people who manned those ships and the women who supported them on shore, who came from Sicily, who came from Portuguese islands, who are not then the typical ethnic makeup of the North Shore of Boston.
Right.
It's not Pride's Crossing, it's not Marblehead, it's not Manchester by the Sea. It's a unique amalgam of people, which is not to idealize it. I mean, it's a hellish work that was done here.
Right.
I'm planning with Henry a discussion about Gloucester's history in the slave trade, the slave economy. Not unique, by the way, just as an example of New England relationship both to slavery and to abolition. I mean, both were in play here. So it's a complex and multifaceted in ethnic and social class terms, which is unusual for a New England town, maybe unusual for the country, but that is part of also the granite rocks, the Atlantic splash and harshness and beauty that we find here.
Yes, I've definitely picked up more, or I am cherry picking in a way Gloucester's, to me, the part of it that feels polyglot or cosmopolitan in the best sense of that, of those terms. That there's an incredible sense of sort of certainly class diversity and sort of industrial diversity, and there's a rich literary tradition at the same time that there's this like serious fishing industry, and now you have this kind of world of, it feels to us like a sort of a city that has a remarkable diversity of like neighborhoods and enclaves, I guess you would say. And the other thing that I think I have been doing in Gloucester also is we did events. Henry hosted me for a reading or two, and I remember thinking, who's going to show up in Gloucester? And there was this big crowd of serious, enthusiastic readers. For the last 4 or 5 years, I and Erin, my wife, have been doing these events, the book club events at Duckworth's Bistro, which we're also clearly very seriously addicted to that food. And of course, that's all thrown up in the air by COVID, but literally probably twice a year or once a year at least, I've been doing those events and just been astonished at the density of literary history in the city as well. So it's like all these things, every time I go up, I learn at least 1 or 2 new fascinating things and say, really? That's also in Gloucester? So anyway.
Well, I got enamored of a phenomenon in the wintertime of the dredging of the channel of the Annisquam River to make way for seafaring, both commercial and for fun. But there was a lone steam shovel, and I began to think about a children's story about a steam shovel.
Mike Mulligan, yeah.
And I mentioned it to a Gloucester friend who said, well, do you know Virginia Lee Burton wrote all of her great stories in Lanesville, which is one town further up on the way to Rockport from Annisquam.
Right.
And she wrote Mike Mulligan and his steam shovel and the little house and other stories that maybe your parents read you, that my parents read me as a kid. So it deepened there as well. But I want to just, since we're here in the Maud Olson Library, and I'm not going to go off on a academic path, but Olson wrote in his second letter, in the Maximus letter, just to read a stanza, he says, they hid or tried to hide the fact the cargo their ships brought back was black. The library too possibly so found it. The point is, the light does go one way toward the post office and quite another way down to Main Street, nor is that all. And then he goes on. The point is, he's saying there's a history here that's complicated.
Right.
That some of the wealth that you see in the houses downtown or wherever, perhaps got their wealth through slave economy. And as I said, Henry and I are planning a session similar to the one we're doing now with a historian who knows a lot of the local emancipation and slave history. And with that in mind, Steve, we met 7 weeks ago, and you drew to our attention as we were talking about the kind of bad stories that were kind of infecting American life, media, culture, politics, that George Floyd had been murdered that day.
Yeah.
And we're now 7 weeks out from his death, a mobilization around Black Lives Matter that no one anticipated, that clearly has reference to the COVID in certain respect. One of the things you brought up in our talk was the problem of getting into the depth, the inner person, to sort of confront these bad stories that are maybe internalized or that are so easily activated by the dividers among us, and that strategy doesn't get counteracted in the media, and therefore the public discourse tends to be along the lines of these stories. I just want to pick up on that 7 weeks out from where we were.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that was the day that we had that discussion. And I mean, fundamentally, what's heartbreaking is that it would take a global pandemic, and then it would take a murder filmed in its entirety. Again, as Henry knows as a filmmaker, we are ruled by the visual image. If there's B-roll, it's going to be a bigger story. And I remember seeing this and seeing that the entirety of it was filmed, and the officer's attitude and Floyd's attitude and his words, I mean his physical attitude, the fact that his neck was being crushed. You could only see one officer, and I immediately saw that as a former, an apostate journalist, and said, this is going to be a big, big, big moment, because we now have actual verifiable proof of white supremacy in the form of a murder, a snuff film really, state-sponsored, that is so undeniable that it is going to be impossible for all but the most brainwashed Americans to dispute the very basic facts of systemic racism and white supremacy as it operates around us and within us. And by that I mean within all of us. But to me, the downside of it is that it is deeply distressing that it would take global pandemic and then a murder in broad daylight for the better angels to be summoned within the squishy 15% who still hadn't figured out that this was a transnational crime syndicate masquerading as a government. It's like, does it have to get that bad and have been that bad for so many people and be put in our faces for people to have their conscience awoken? And even still, when I look at polls, I'm guilty of that kind of compulsive poll checking, because I remember Watergate, and the lesson in Watergate was once Nixon was down to 30 or 25%, that was it, the jig was up. And if that doesn't happen, then people will act in their own interests. At least the people in the Republican Party are going to act in their own political interests. So I have a very sort of practical, hard line. And what amazes me always when I look at these polls is, who can look at this with a straight face and say, yeah, this is the government that America should have? That's what astonishes me, is not that the disapproval rating is 57 or whatever. It's what kind of story do you have to construct where, the obvious murder of people of color and the systemic, sort of warehousing of them and the railroading of them in the criminal justice system, that's not enough. And then it takes actually a whole pandemic where you've got whatever it is now, we're going to be in the millions of cases and in 135,000 deaths, and I think those are even underreported. And you've got the total disruption of everybody's life, because this is not a federal government that cares to govern. It's so overt and blatant, and it's like the alarm system in our national conscience is so broken that it takes the house being on fire, and it's got to get up to the 5th floor before anybody really says, maybe we should evacuate. And I don't even, and I hope we will evacuate into a more sound set of stories about what public service consists of. I mean, you know, again, I think there was a sense amongst all of these atrocities in a morally sane culture are the authors of, in some way or another, a moral awakening, right? Going back to abolition and suffrage, there are always people who see the injustice, and in fact, I think all of us, to some extent, if we're honest, see it. The question is when it reaches a tipping point and people start acting on it, and no longer, you know, it's like this great line in this song that we listen to a lot, you know, you got to make racists ashamed again. Like, that's what you have to do. It can't be something that is okay and normal. It has to be something that is regarded as shameful and something we need to rid ourselves of. And there, I think all along that was where that was how sort of the BOP has been demagoguing, and now it's so obvious in the same way that the cost of a government that simply does not care to govern, the kind of nihilistic approach, which really honestly begins with Reagan. Government is the problem. The 9 most, you know, the 9 scariest words, I'm from the government, I'm here to help. That is the opposite, as we talked about last time, of the attitude expressed, for instance, in The Grapes of Wrath, where government is the hero. And that's, you know, directly out of the New Deal and the Great Society and the War on Poverty and stuff that, Peter, you remember from your own time working in the community in New Haven. You know, that there. So to answer your question, kind of taking the long way, taking the Gloucester route, there have always been people who are morally awakened by moral atrocities in their midst. The question is when it reaches a groundswell enough that it really starts shifting people who are insulated enough to be able to ignore it or say, boy, that's a pity. To do more than that, to become politically involved and active, even if it's just to the extent of voting in another way than might be in their economic interests. But hopefully more than that. And I think we are in that moment, and that's why you see really a very dramatic, I mean, again, it should be much more dramatic, but within how polarized the country is, there is just a clear consensus. This is a failed government that is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, and in many ways is doing just the opposite of what a compassionate, enlightened leadership would do.
But what you, again, back to the actual day that George Floyd was murdered, and that we happened to have our first conversation, and on these topics, you were expressing a kind of realism that the culture alienated from its inner life becomes susceptible to racism, division, and the like, the bad stories. And you go further to say the media is not a corrective. The media doesn't go for empathy, for the empathic, for virtue. And my question is, in this remarkable moment of COVID, the metaphor of breathing. I can't breathe, says George Floyd, says Eric Garner, says the person in the intensive care unit with COVID.
Right.
And what is happening that is possibly different than your description of things 7 weeks ago and what you wrote in your Trump book about bad stories and so on. So it's this problem, Steve. I just want to pick up, I'm going to elaborate one point.
Sure.
That I've always, your intense and evocative argument for the inner life, but in a public space, where you get this kind of problem of after the Trump unexpected victory. How do we speak to those people? Who were they who voted for him? How can we bridge that? The New York Times hires Dan Barry Weiss to bridge the gap, a total ideologue hack. But anyway, how do you take up the inner life among working women and men who don't have much time for a daily life, let alone an inner life?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, those are two different questions. To answer the first question is really, so why did we see such a sea change in the last 7 weeks? Two things. it became, again, I Can't Breathe is a kind of undeniable atrocity that is playing out right in front of our eyes, and there's no moral ambiguity to it. It's clear, and we have now all the footage, it's clear that this guy, whatever, trying to pass a phony $20 bill, being a little drunk, he was not hostile, he was not a threat, and he did not need to be bound in that way. It was a murder. It's undeniable. So part of it is to see that, and then to have the response from an increasingly militarized police and from Trump be, go after them, let's go ahead and clear the park of peaceful protesters, and you have Australian journalists being, exercising the freedoms enshrined in the First Amendment, being brutalized by police, and people being tear gassed, and repeated images of police brutality in the face of largely peaceful protests. There was, they got a little bit of looting on camera, but basically it was mostly peaceful protests. Everybody could see that. So you had this original sin that is then compounded by a response that's ultimately fascistic, and people see it and they get that this guy's pitching. He's never even read a Bible, doesn't even know whether it's upside down or not. He's standing in front, it's hollow. And even it becomes so overt that this guy is a salesman, and a failed salesman, that he's Willy Loman. He's not, Atlas Shrugged's hero. He's not Reagan, he's Willy Loman. He's a failed salesman. And it becomes so obvious, the optics and the visual images, the footage of it. Meanwhile, at the same time, he refuses to really recognize that there is this deadly pandemic. People are dying large and disproportionately in communities of color and poultry and people in old age homes, retirement communities. And those are people who are in one way or another disenfranchised, but they're not totally out of view. And even if you are, everybody's been shut down and nobody can go see their friends, school's over. All this stuff is happening that is such an upheaval, and the response to it, or the predictions of it, will magically go away. It's so obviously revealed as a failed salesman. You can't con a pandemic. It doesn't work. You can't con it. It's not how it works. You might be able to work some of the rubes in the room whose inner lives are ready for your demagogic message, who feel a sense of cultural utility that's been lost, who are ready to sort of find somebody to blame because they've got a lot of sorrow that's been converted or disfigured into anger. That just happens. And all of us in our own ways, fall into those traps. But you cannot con a pandemic. And until it really hit the red communities, I mean that, just roughly speaking, the conservative communities, the Trump counties, now it is roaring through. And it has been laid bare in a way that's simply undeniable. I Can't Breathe is now a threat that everybody hangs under. The angel of death is over all the homes. And so that's part of the reason I think there's been this sea change. As for this notion of how do we reach across and talk to this, to people who are really so believe this guy is, or need to believe this guy is, a hero, a savior, a bully who will, take care of them or protect them in some way. Right-wing radio has been whispering, the voice of Father Coughlin and all the demagogues that followed him have been whispering in these people's ears for 20, 30, 40 years. Nothing anybody says, let alone some, flaming commie from Boston, Massachusetts. I have no illusions that I am going to do or say anything that will influence somebody's thinking when they are centrally ruled by shame. The whole thing about the hidden Trump voter is people are ashamed. They know that this is an indecent person. They know this is not somebody they would trust, or an administration they would trust with their anything. You wouldn't hand these guys, your child to take care of, your school to run, your public land to somehow be a steward of. So I think there's a feeling in some quarters, and I think the media definitely falls victim. But how do we reach these alienated people? It was really just their economic anxiety. And I think that's just a bad story. I think they're largely under the influence of psychological and emotional struggles that just make them vulnerable to demagoguery and invulnerable to moral common sense and even their own self-interest. And I have no interest in trying to influence their thinking one way or the other. They have a right to their inner life. They have a right to their political action in the community. The Tea Party was hyped. It was funded by corporations, but it was also a bunch of people who figured out that they could be politically active and effective. And the job of people, of citizens of good conscience, is to now figure that out for themselves and not to criticize the Tea Party, but to say, okay, now we need a real, actual, morally centered populist movement. And I do think that that's part of what's happened. Here we are today. Joe Biden releases a huge, monumentally ambitious plan to say, let's really fight and address climate change and make it an engine of our economic recovery. Well, that is not a thought that would have occurred to Joe Biden a year ago or 3 years ago, let alone 30 years ago. So I do think that there is a general feeling of, well, we've tried awful right-wing demagoguery and proto-fascist authoritarian salesman guy. Maybe we need to go in another direction. And these are all, it is being made so obvious that even in a hyper-polarized country, he's going down. And the question now is, in what ways will he try to disrupt and cheat? And that's what I think about as we're moving forward, is in order for that better set of stories to be at the center of the culture, we have to get rid of the agitators and dividers who distract us from the kind of moral progress. And that's a lot of what people, I think, found so empowering about the protest movement that is still happening. And you can speak to this, Pete, from your own experience in New Haven. They said, you've got to shoulder the burden of hope if you want to believe that there can be a better set of possibilities. And people are ready for that. Yeah. I think people are exhausted by feeling dispirited, and the only galvanizing emotions are grievance and anger and this palette of emotions that's draining.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm looking at a case that's more both up to date and way out of date. In an essay I'm writing about Gone with the Wind, and in particular about the way AT&T, the owning company now of Warner Media and of HBO Max, which is offering Gone with the Wind. It got in a quick chronology is that HBO Max launched 2 days after George Floyd's death. And about a week and a half later, a very influential LA African-American writer-director wrote an op-ed kind of pleading very systematically with the producers, sponsors, to pull the film because of its racist content and its caricature of African Americans, distortion of the historical era of slavery, Civil War, and Reconstruction. So what do? They pull the film within 2 days of the challenge for historical critique. And 2 weeks later, they reinstate the film with a 4-minute kind of warning label. You know, it says, viewing this film will be harmful to your health because it's racist, but it's a classic film, and we feel that this 4-minute explanation will balance the scale. Well, the film is the 5th top box office film of all time. It's made $500 million. It has been playing almost nightly for 80 years. And what they're doing is putting it back on the air with this, like a cigarette warning label showing a wounded lung. And so a racist image of a large, the African American population is being sanctioned by AT&T, Warner, and HBO. And what we're arguing is, okay, we're not for pulling the film, because there are First Amendment and freedom of expression, artistic right. We're arguing that why not put up a few $100 million for new production that take up some of the same issues. Doesn't have to go back to Civil War or history, but let's hear from people of color in the entertainment field at a high level of production and of artistic aspiration, and tell some stories that we don't tend to see, but at the same high level of production value that makes Gone with the Wind so seductive, so undeniable in its romantic appeal.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, the trap here is an old American trap, which is, you know, everybody wants a bacon cheeseburger, but nobody wants to visit the slaughterhouse, really.
Yeah.
And everybody wants their football as a personal, personal point of connection.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful and ornate game, and strategically dense and balletic and heroic, and full of mostly masculine virtues, if I can use that word rather romantically. But at the same time, it's all these other things. So I think the argument you would make with Gone with the Wind is, well, it's a sweeping story, and there's romance in it, and it's got a kind of fantasia fairy tale setting that has been glamorized, and that people always want a fairy tale. They always want a fairy tale because a fairy tale flattens out complicated people and situations so that they're, binary. And the big struggle isn't, gee, you're this entire lifestyle is predicated on human bondage. You're mopping your profit from the sweat of another man's brow, right? Lincoln's famous phrase. You should be ashamed, basically, to be up to that. It becomes, well, is Scarlett gonna, is Rhett and Scarlett gonna get together or not? And I guess it's whitewashing, really, of what the life on a plantation was. But there have always been soap operas. There have always been these fairy tales that have been put in place to protect people from the kind of moral atrocity that is part of their everyday lives and economies. So here we are with all this wonderful technology to be able to do this, and much of it was, produced not with slave labor, but with labor in factories that are sufficiently stultifying and deleterious to the human soul that the workers are throwing themselves, committing suicide at alarming rates. So if you see what I mean, the struggle is for people to come into consciousness about the ways in which they are participants in always in systems of power that ultimately they would not want to have imposed on them. If they were on the if I had to make the iPhone rather than just using it, I would have a very different attitude about the utility and beauty and wonderfulness of an iPhone. And that's, I think, capitalism and America is the capital at this point of that kind of delusion. In a way, it's the same kind of moral disconnect taken to its logical extreme that allows a federal government to simply not govern during a global pandemic, or to pretend and tell themselves a happy fairy tale about it will all go away. In 15 cases will go down to none, and when it gets warm it will go away. That sort of disassociated thinking, it's not sociopathic, it's infantile, it's childish, it's the thinking of a child. If I close my eyes it will go away. But all of us, I think, and this is part of the reason that I feel like the sea change has to be more than getting rid of one political actor or regime, or even sort of stopping the ascendance of a corrupt party. All of us, COVID is just the warm-up act for climate change in terms of the amount of disruption that we're going to encounter and the way in which it's going to lay bare the racial and class injustice that America was built on. And so that is part of the struggle of this moment. And I think watching Gone with the Wind is a way to sort of look away from all of that. And I guess it finds a certain kind of cognate in this idea that Trump was trying to hustle up, trying to sell of, I'm trying to protect our heritage and our history. In fact, if you think about it, nobody's got a problem with quote-unquote Southern heritage, that is, with the idea that we should look back at that history and try to understand it and celebrate the parts that are worth celebrating, but we should look at all of it. Yeah. To your point, Peter, if we're going to look at Gone with the Wind, we should see the truth that lives underneath that fairy tale, and in fact necessitates in some way the creation of that fairy tale. And that's what we should be up to. But Hollywood, as you know, as somebody who hails from Hollywood, does not ask. It asks the same question that the quote-unquote leader asks, which is, what are the ratings? What's the box office?
Yeah.
Where's the money?
Yeah.
And the money is in fairy tales, and the money is in cigarettes, or was, and the money is in, Big Macs and the Super Bowl. That's where the money is. And one of the things, just parenthetically, that I think is so fascinating about the kind of awakening of the Black Lives Matter protest movement in this latest iteration is that there has been an absence of those distractions. Sports went away. Our great big sort of zone where we could not only just immerse ourselves in a reality where winning and losing we could experience, but it didn't really hurt us personally, didn't hurt our brains, didn't, all we really had invested was our wishes for our team or whatever, or for a good match. That's all gone away. And I think as a result of that, people have more bandwidth to really look and take a stark look at what is the country right now? What has it become under this leadership? We have followed the snake oil salesman and his set of fairy tales and divisions to its logical extreme here, and where have we arrived? Are we happier? Are we less anxious? Do we feel closer to our fellow man? Do we feel a sense of commitment to our communities? And I think that's part of what you're seeing. Is the answer is no. People are miserable and anxious and tired of it.
Well, as we kind of wrap up this part 2 of our almond dialogue,
Yes.
what are you, as an engaged writer, parent, citizen, what are you doing yourself right now in taking up these issues and communicating about them?
Well, a few things. One is that I am trying to help my older daughter, my oldest child, with editing her blog, which began as an examination of queer history of revolutionary figures, and has more recently, as she has been influenced by, because we've been going to the protests in Arlington, she's become more interested in John Laurens, this figure from Hamilton who wanted to create a black battalion during the Revolutionary War, and was somebody who was an early proponent of abolition. He's kind of a heroic figure in Hamilton. He is the great abolitionist, the great white savior. And Josie, my daughter, has been thinking about, but wait a second, he was the son of the owner of the largest slave trading house in South Carolina. He was he himself was given 2 valets or servants for his wartime efforts, and she has been poring through the way that he regarded African Americans in his service, basically, and wrote about them, as well as how he was even in a position to become sort of part of Washington's coterie, and realizing that even though he was heroic in many of his behaviors, he was also a person of his time, which is to say the beneficiary of and a participant in the system of white supremacy. So she wrote, and maybe we'll link to it when this goes up, a really interesting, fascinating examination of the real Laurens and the complexities, and tried to trace it out to what does it mean for us as white allies in this moment? What does that mean? And what action should we be taking? And also internally, how should we be thinking about the difficulties and moral complexities of being a quote-unquote white ally, when ultimately it is for the most part, not our skin that's in the game, if you know what I mean. We are not at risk. So what are we doing to prevent risk to others? So that's one thing. The other thing I've been doing is working on a long, probably failed novel that, ironically enough, I started in 2015. I put aside because I became too distracted by the election. But what was it about? It was about immigration, undocumented people, the criminal justice system, and the way that the media and law enforcement conspire to make terrible, unjust decisions that have horrible consequences. I had no idea when I picked it up again in 2019 that we would have any of this happening. But I do feel like, if you think about it, your luck only runs for so long. When you are fundamentally playing as dangerous a game as America's been playing, your luck runs out at a certain point. And you can look, now people can look around the world and see that governments, mostly run by women, frankly, but governments in European countries and other countries have figured this out and gotten COVID under control. It becomes even more obvious. Okay, our luck has run out. That nice Obama economy and juicing with tax cuts for all the wealthy people, that at a certain point that no longer works. Your luck runs out. And so I've been trying to finish that novel in the hopes that it will, even though it's set in the Reagan era, at the dawn of the Reagan era, I was thinking even before Trump came along, in a way, we haven't reckoned with certain bad stories. And so I want to try to tell a story that gets at where the animus for government and the idea of competent governance really took root, and the idea of turn it over to the private sector and turn away from our public duty to one another, where a lot of that became romanticized, became its own version of Gone with the Wind, except America's going to be gone. So anyway, the shining city on the hill, all of that mythos is something that I guess as a child of the Reagan era, I'd been thinking about for a long time, and now I'm trying to contain it in a big, messy novel that's probably terrible and maybe will never come out and be in the world, but it's part of my way of working through this stuff.
That's amazing.
Well, we'll
thank
see.
you.
I don't know. It's not amazing right now. It's a big, lousy draft, but it's what I'm after in the creative work.
It's where you are.
Yeah, it's where I am. It's where I am. It's where we all are, turns out.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Steve.